10 years ago, my mother looked me in the eye at my own wedding and told me I was already dead to her. I want you to sit with that for a second because it's not a metaphor. She said it exactly like that. As far as this family is concerned, you are already dead to us. Then she turned around, walked out of a courthouse hallway in her cream-colored suit, and got into a car that drove her back to a life I was no longer allowed to be part of. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what happened in the 10 years between that hallway and the morning 3 months ago when my mother's lawyer called me and said 7 words that made my hands shake so badly I dropped my coffee mug on the kitchen floor. He said, "We need your signature, it's urgent." Let me back up because you need to understand exactly what they threw away and exactly what it cost me to survive it before you understand why those 7 words mattered so much. I grew up in a house with marble floors and a name that opened doors before I even said a word. My father built a logistics and freight company from almost nothing in the 70s, the kind of story people tell at dinner parties, worked 2 jobs, saved every dollar, took one enormous risk on a shipping contract that could have ruined him, and instead made him rich beyond anything he'd imagined. By the time I was born, we weren't just comfortable. We were the kind of family that had wings of the house nobody used, that had a driver, that had a name on a hospital donor wall. My mother came from old money on the other side. The kind of family that measured a person's worth by which country club they belonged to and whose daughter married which son of which other important family. She never worked a day in her life, not because she couldn't, but because in her world, working was something other people did. She spent her days managing a household staff, sitting on charity boards that mostly existed so wealthy women had somewhere to wear their jewelry, and slowly, carefully building the life she expected me to inherit, a life with a similarly wealthy husband, a similarly enormous house, and children who would go to the same private schools she went to. I was supposed to be the perfect continuation of that story. I went to the right schools. I learned to make small talk at charity galas before I was old enough to drive. I dated exactly the kind of boys my mother approved of, the sons of my father's business partners, the nephews of judges, boys with trust funds and yacht club memberships and absolutely nothing interesting to say. And then when I was 24, I met Marcus. Marcus worked in my father's warehouse, not in the office, not in management, on the floor loading trucks, doing 12-hour shifts in the summer heat, coming home every night with his hands raw and his back aching. He'd grown up the son of a single mother who cleaned houses for a living. The irony of that detail is not lost on me, given what I'm about to tell you about my own life. He'd never been to college. He'd learned everything he knew about work ethic and dignity from watching his mother clean other people's homes without ever once complaining, without ever once thinking less of herself for doing honest work. I met him because my father's company held an annual employee appreciation event, the kind of thing my mother considered beneath her but tolerated because my father insisted on it, one of the few things he refused to let her control. I was 24, bored, dragged along by my father to hand out some kind of ceremonial award, and Marcus was the one who made me laugh for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not because he was trying to impress me. He didn't even know who I was at first. He just talked to me like a person, which, looking back, might have been the single most unfamiliar experience of my entire sheltered life up to that point. We fell in love slowly, and then all at once, the way it happens when you've spent your whole life performing a version of yourself for other people's approval and suddenly meet someone who only wants the real one. I didn't tell my parents for almost a year. I knew, somewhere underneath the hope I was carrying, exactly how this was going to go. But eventually you can't keep 2 lives running in parallel forever, and eventually I had to choose which one was real. I brought Marcus home on a Sunday evening in October. I remember exactly what he wore, the nicest shirt he owned, ironed twice, because he'd asked me 3 times if it was good enough. I remember my mother's face when I introduced him not as a friend, but as the man I was in love with. I remember the silence that followed, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a room until someone finally breaks it. My father was the one who broke it. He didn't yell. That was almost worse. He just asked Marcus to leave the room so he could speak with me privately, and when it was just the 3 of us, my father, my mother, and me, he said very calmly, "You understand this ends your life as you know it." I said I understood love wasn't supposed to have a price tag attached to it. My mother laughed, not a warm laugh. The kind of laugh that tells you exactly how far beneath consideration your opinion has just fallen. She said, "Everything has a price tag. You've simply never had to see the number before." I married Marcus 8 months later, in a small courthouse ceremony with 12 guests, none of whom shared my last name. My mother came, I'll give her that much, but only, I understand now, to deliver one final message in person rather than by letter. She stood in the hallway afterward in her cream-colored suit, and told me that as far as this family was concerned, I was already dead to them. My father didn't come at all. He sent a card. It said, "I hope you understand what you're giving up." No signature, just those 9 words, like he couldn't even bring himself to write his own name to something addressed to me anymore. They cut me off completely. Not just financially, though that happened too, immediately, every account closed, my name removed from every document, every trust, every piece of paper that had once made me an heiress. They cut me off socially. Every friend I'd grown up with quietly stopped returning my calls within a few months. Because when you're raised in that world, you learn early that loyalty to your parents' approval matters more than loyalty to actual people. They cut me off from my own extended family. Cousins I'd known my whole life suddenly acted like they'd never met me at events I wasn't invited to anymore. I want to tell you those first 2 years were romantic in the way movies make poverty look romantic. 2 young people in love figuring out life together with nothing but each other. They weren't. They were terrifying. I had never paid a bill in my life. I didn't know how to budget for groceries. Marcus and I lived in a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat, and some nights we ate rice and canned beans for dinner 3 nights in a row because that was what the math allowed for that week. But here's what I learned in that apartment above the laundromat, in a way I never could have learned in a marble house with a driver. I learned that I was capable of things nobody, including me, had ever tested. I got a job as a receptionist at a small accounting firm because it was the only place that would hire someone with my non-existent work history. I was terrible at it for the first 3 months. I cried in the bathroom more than once. And then slowly I got good at it. Not because I had some hidden natural talent, but because for the first time in my life, failing actually cost me something, and that made me pay attention in a way privilege never had. Marcus and I built a life brick by brick, the hard way, the way most people build lives, nothing handed to us, nothing guaranteed. Within 4 years, I'd moved from receptionist to junior bookkeeper to office manager. Within 6, I'd gone back to school part-time at night, exhausted, and got a degree in accounting while working full-time. Marcus, meanwhile, had left the warehouse and started his own small logistics consulting business, using everything he'd learned on that warehouse floor about how freight actually moves, how companies actually waste money, how the whole system actually works from the ground up rather than from a corner office. It was slow, it was hard. There were years we genuinely didn't know if we'd make rent. But by year 8, something had shifted. Marcus's consulting business had grown from just him to a small team of 6. I'd left the accounting firm and started managing the books and operations for his company full-time. And between the two of us, we'd built something that was entirely, undeniably ours, not inherited, not given, built. By year 10, the year the phone call came, we owned a modest but comfortable house in a good school district for the daughter we now had. A 6-year-old named Sophie who had never met her grandparents and didn't know they existed. We weren't wealthy by my parents' standards. We weren't even close. But we were stable and secure, and this is the part that still surprises me when I say it out loud, happier than I had ever been in that marble house with all its wings nobody used. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 10 years. I hadn't spoken to my father in 10 years. I'd heard secondhand, through the kind of gossip that travels even across broken family lines, that my father's company had continued to grow, that they'd expanded into 3 new states, that my mother still sat on the same charity boards wearing the same kind of jewelry. I'd heard about 2 years before the phone call that my father had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's, and that he'd started slowly stepping back from daily operations. I remember feeling something complicated when I heard that, not warmth exactly, because warmth requires a relationship, and we didn't have one, but something closer to the strange, hollow ache of hearing that a stranger who used to matter to you is struggling, and not knowing what, if anything, you're allowed to feel about it. Then 3 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Gerald Whitfield, my father's longtime corporate attorney, a name I actually remembered from childhood, a quiet, serious man who used to come to the house for dinner and talk business with my father in low voices after the meal. He said my name carefully, like he wasn't sure I'd still answer to it. Then he said the 7 words that made my hands shake so badly I dropped my coffee mug on the kitchen floor. "We need your signature." "It's urgent." I asked him what he possibly could need from me after 10 years of complete and total silence. And what he told me next took almost 20 minutes to fully explain, but I'm going to give you the short version because the short version is what matters. My father's original company structure, the one he built from nothing back in the 70s, had been set up decades ago before I was even born, with a clause that neither my mother nor I had ever paid much attention to, because at the time it was drafted, it was purely a formality. The company's founding trust required unanimous sign-off from all living direct descendants of the founder before any full sale, merger, or dissolution of the company could be finalized. At the time my father wrote it, it made sense, a way to protect the family business from being sold off by a future generation without consensus. He had exactly one direct descendant, me. For 10 years, this clause had simply never come up, because there had never been an offer significant enough or urgent enough to require the company to actually dissolve or sell in full. But 6 weeks before that phone call, a major logistics conglomerate had approached my father's company with an acquisition offer worth $220 million. An offer my father, now dealing with worsening health and a board eager to cash out before market conditions shifted, desperately wanted to accept. There was just one problem. The trust required my signature, not my mother's, not the board's. Mine specifically as the founder's sole direct descendant, regardless of any personal estrangement, regardless of any family history, because the document had been written in cold legal language decades before any of that history existed. Gerald told me carefully that my parents had spent almost 3 weeks trying to find a way around it before finally accepting there wasn't one. 3 of the state's top estate attorneys had confirmed the same thing. The clause was airtight. Without my signature, the deal worth $220 million could not close. I sat on my kitchen floor, coffee pooling around broken ceramic, and I laughed. I actually laughed, the kind of laugh that surprises you because it comes from somewhere much deeper and stranger than humor. 10 years of silence. 10 years of being told I was dead to them. 10 years of my mother's voice in that courthouse hallway playing on a loop in my head every time I doubted myself in that 600-square-foot apartment. 10 years of building a life from nothing, brick by brick, while they lived exactly as they always had, never once checking whether their daughter was even alive, let alone whether she was okay. And now, because of a piece of paper my father wrote before I was born, they needed me. I told Gerald I'd think about it. He sounded surprised, I don't think, given everything he expected, hesitation. I hung up the phone and I sat with Marcus that night after Sophie was asleep, and we talked about it for hours. Here is what I want you to understand about that conversation, because I think it's the part of this story people relate to the most, more than the money, more than the betrayal. I wasn't tempted by cruelty. I didn't spend that night fantasizing about revenge. What I spent that night doing was finally, for the first time in a decade, asking myself honestly what I actually wanted from the people who raised me, not what I was owed, not what would hurt them the most, but what I actually honestly wanted. And what I realized, sitting on our couch with Marcus's hand in mine, was that I wanted them to say my name again like it meant something. I wanted, more than I wanted any percentage of $220 million, for my mother to look at the life I'd built, the one she told me would ruin me, and admit, out loud, that she'd been wrong. I called Gerald back 3 days later and told him I'd sign, but I had conditions. Not financial ones. This surprised him too. I told him I wanted a meeting, in person, with both of my parents together before I signed anything. Not a lawyer's office, not neutral ground. I wanted them in a room, looking at me for the first time in 10 years before I gave them what they needed. The meeting happened 2 weeks later, in the same house I grew up in, the marble floors, the unused wings. All of it exactly as I remembered, and somehow smaller than I remembered too. The way childhood places always shrink once you've built a life somewhere else. My mother had aged in ways that surprised me. Not just the visible ways, the gray she no longer fully colored, the lines around her eyes, but something in how she held herself. A carefulness that hadn't been there 10 years earlier, when she'd stood in that hallway with total, unshakable certainty that she was right about everything. My father was in a wheelchair now, something I hadn't been told, something that hit me harder than I expected given everything, given 10 years of silence. Because underneath all of it, he was still my father, and watching him struggle to lift a coffee cup did something to the part of me I'd spent a decade trying to protect. I sat across from them in the same sitting room where they'd once told me love had a price tag I hadn't yet learned to read. And I let the silence sit there for a long moment before I spoke, because for 10 years, they'd been comfortable letting silence be the last word between us, and I wanted them to feel just once what that kind of silence costs. Then I told them about the apartment above the laundromat, about the receptionist job I cried through for 3 months before I got good at it, about Marcus's consulting business, built from a warehouse floor and nothing else, about Sophie, their granddaughter, who had a laugh just like my father's and had never once heard his voice. My mother cried. I hadn't seen my mother cry since I was a child, maybe not even then. My father, in his wheelchair, with hands that shook now from more than just anger, said my name the way he used to say it before that October evening 10 years ago, like it belonged to someone he loved, not someone he'd written off. I signed the document that day. Not out of forgiveness, I've learned, isn't something you can rush just because someone finally needs you. I signed it because $220 million sitting in a stalled deal wasn't going to teach my parents anything my absence hadn't already taught them for 10 years. What I wanted, I'd realized, wasn't to punish them with the signature. It was to make sure that when I finally gave it, they understood exactly what it had cost me to become someone capable of walking away from needing them at all. I also did something Gerald hadn't expected, and my parents definitely hadn't expected. As part of the agreement, I requested a small, direct percentage of the sale proceeds be placed not in my name, but in a trust for Sophie, the granddaughter my parents had never met, with the condition that they could only access a relationship with her, going forward on Sophie's terms, when she was old enough to decide that for herself. Not mine, not theirs, hers. My mother didn't argue. I think by that point she understood she'd lost the right to. It's been 3 months since that meeting. My parents call now sometimes. I don't always answer. Marcus's business has grown enough on its own, entirely separate from any of this, that we didn't need a cent of that inheritance to keep building the life we already had. And I think that fact, more than the check itself, is what finally made my mother understand what she actually gave up 10 years ago in that courthouse hallway. She didn't just lose a daughter who married beneath her, in her words. She lost 10 years of a granddaughter's laugh, 10 years of watching someone she raised become someone she never gave herself the chance to be proud of. And no signature, no matter how many zeros came attached to it, was ever going to buy that back. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's this. The people who tell you that you're throwing your life away for love are very often the same people who will need something from you one day, once the life you built without them turns out to be stronger than the one they tried to keep you in. Build it anyway. If this story moved you, hit subscribe to Midnight Drama Stories for more real emotional stories like this one every week, and tell me in the comments, would you have signed?